All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Bociurkiw. I'll be your moderator for this panel on World Briefing, the big tech, how tech went from bad to good, or did it really? I am here now in beautiful Sydney by the Sea in British Columbia, Canada. This is the second in occasional series of my World Briefing panels hosted by Frontline Events in London. As for me, I'm a global affairs analyst, regular contributor to CNN Opinion, and author of the book Digital Pandemic. I also used to live in Seattle during the high-tech boom. Possibly not, some of you weren't even born then, but those were heady days at Microsoft and places like that. And I wrote a lot at the time for Forbes ASAP about the tech boom. And that kind of started my whole interest in technology. Now, I think, well, we can't say we're in the post-pandemic phase, but we're certainly still living with the pandemic. But I think most of us can agree on one thing, that without technology, it would have been very difficult, if not impossible, to endure those long pandemic lockdowns that enabled us to work from home, stay up to date on outbreaks and things like school closures, watch endless reruns of that hand sock swallowing up passing cars as they rush past a window during the lockdown, access telehealth or order wood-fire pizza from our favorite New York City pizza joint. Of course, stay connected with loved ones, or God forbid, say goodbye for the very last time to loved ones who succumbed to the virus. And of course, our thoughts and prayers go out to everyone who has been impacted by this pandemic. But in many, many ways, tech showed its good side. As one Silicon Valley analyst said, living through the pandemic has not been fun at all. But imagine doing it without all this technology. Overall, the impact of technology during COVID-19 was a bit of a mixed bag. Plenty of experts say that these devices that we all use have for years, well before the pandemic, been responsible for everything from teenage gambling addiction to relationship breakups, not to mention all the data they collect and then spin to manipulate us into chasing bottomless time sinks and going down those infamous information rabbit holes. But the COVID-19 crisis may end up giving technology a badly needed image reboot. The new technology that was previously frowned upon suddenly, as I pointed out, became indispensable. It let everyone cooped up at home connect with loved ones or consult health professionals via software like Zoom. Lockdowns became semi-manageable because we had apps to order takeaways. And we could have, for example, Prosecco-fueled happy hours with friends half a world away. And really importantly, I think, people young and old use the tools to find support groups to cope with loneliness. And I think that the stigmatization often associated with mental health issues diminished as more and more admitted to anxiety or depression and openly sought treatment, very often through online platforms. And there's something called, I think you've all heard of it, called the digital divide or digital gap. It exists not only in the developing world, but also in places like here in North America. It can be very bad in some urban centers. But a report by Bain & Company said, if not for home-based learning, 135 million school children in Southeast Asia would have lost access to education. And amid all of this, of course, the platforms themselves the owners of the platforms became immensely wealthier by the surge in usage. One figure I dug up, former Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos' personal wealth grew to 184 billion, an increase of 63%. And I'm also told that the yacht he's now building actually costs more than what he paid for the Washington Post. Go figure. And of course, the platforms continue to collect and sell our data and enable the spread of false narratives. And, you know, think about it. We're going to be talking about this on the panel on how we should keep our guard up when it comes to how our data is being used. But think about how many of us have logged into free Wi-Fi services while traveling, knowing full well it's on secure connection, or click on accept all cookies without reading those ridiculously long conditions that they post. And how many of you have recently tried to tame your device or social media addiction by downloading one of those time management software apps only to disable it later? Many of us are heavy users of Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and other platforms, knowing full well our data is being mined, collected, and sold. So we will discuss all of that in this panel. I'd like to begin, if I may, in my own Pacific time zone with sort of a street level or classroom level view, if you will. We're immensely happy to have with us Diana Graber. She's a California educator and author of Raising Humans in a Digital World, Helping Kids Build a Healthy Relationship with Technology. I think by now I can call Diana a friend and a go-to expert on kids in classroom and tech. She's a nationally recognized expert on digital literacy. She writes, presents, and is interviewed about technology's impact on human behavior. Her no-nonsense approach comes from being an educator, media producer, academic, and most of all, a mom. She developed and still teaches Civics, the popular middle school digital literacy program currently being taught in almost all of the US states and internationally. And she's served as an adjunct faculty teaching media psychology to graduate students. So Diana, welcome. And as you told me in interviews we've done in the past, that during the pandemic, screen time for both adults, but especially kids, went absolutely through the roof. That was quite a few months ago, and I'm wondering if you could update us on the situation as you see it now. And could a bad thing actually turn into a good thing from the pandemic, with kids, for example, much more aware of their screen time and spending time with tech more responsibly, maybe even spending more time outside?
Right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And I'm thinking back fondly to our pre-pandemic conversations where I think we both were really hoping that, technology would be used, particularly by kids, more productively and positively and all that. So then the pandemic hit in, 18 months or so, I've been teaching Zoom classes and just this fall back with kids, which is really lovely. They're so excited to be back in person. It's crazy. But so here's what I think happened. Kids obviously spent a lot more time on computers and all that because they had to for schoolwork, to keep connected to families, and also to be, entertainment, because that was how they soothed themselves from this really chaotic world that they're living in. And so now what I'm seeing with kids in the classroom is they're really excited to be back. Because I teach civics, we talk a lot about technology. And one of the cutest things one of my sixth graders said was, the best thing about the pandemic was Zoom. The worst thing about the pandemic was Zoom. So just like us, they're zoomed out. But here's a couple of things I've observed. Excited to be back face to face. They are so much more savvy with their devices than they were before. They use it to research. They like to do their schoolwork online. So they're using it in a very productive way. And these are pretty young kids that I'm working with. And hats off to teachers. As you know, Michael, I work with a lot of schools that are pretty low tech. And there are a lot of teachers that were like, I'm not touching that stuff. All of a sudden, it's Friday, there's a pandemic, Monday morning, they have to teach on Zoom, right? It was overnight. And so many teachers rose to the occasion so quickly. And so they had this really quick learning curve, and a lot of that has stuck. So I see a lot of the habits that we formed during the pandemic, both with kids and the teachers using technology really productively and well, has stuck throughout. So I hope that we see that going forward, that we all start using our tools in the way that I think they were meant, for good, for positive things, to learn, to connect, and also to remember that face to face is pretty awesome.
Can't agree with you more. And from what you've seen, have you seen any initiatives from big tech to help kids or teachers like yourself better manage your screen time? Or is it very much on all of us to, as you teach kids, to have great social media, smartphone hygiene, and put more of the onus on ourselves?
Well, there's been a lot of initiatives lately, thanks to some new laws in the UK, which I think we see coming eventually to the United States. To get ahead of the curve, the TikToks and Instagrams and all that, they have put more parental controls in place, time limits, all that stuff. But one thing I'll say about that, I mean, that's awesome and everything, but kids disable that stuff very easily. And even worse, people don't use them. Like there's TikTok has some great family pairing mechanisms there so parents can see what their kids are doing. you know, you got to sit down with your kid and actually install these things and turn them on and use them. And that's number one. And number two is I'm such a strong advocate for teaching kids about privacy collection. I mean, kids hate to be manipulated. So it's a great time to teach them that it's not their parents manipulating them, it's the tech companies that are capturing their attention, taking their data. Here's what they're using. They're targeting you with these ads. And that's really a big push with cyber civics is we try to teach them all that so that they can protect themselves. Because turning on and off all these privacy protections, I mean, that's great, but you got to have it up here. You got to know what's happening with your technology and make these hard decisions for yourself the minute you start using it. So that's really what we're focused on, is teaching the next generation to be a lot smarter than we've been.
Great. Well, thank you. We'll come back to you, but we salute your work. In almost all of the US states and internationally, your cyber civics is being used. Bravo to you.
Thank you.
Let's go a little bit further south, all the way down to Santiago, Chile. And with us is Luisa Bandera, is the Associate Editor and Research Associate of Latin America at the Atlantic Council Digital Forensic Research Lab based in Colombia. Luisa is a Brazilian multimedia journalist with 10 years experience. She has worked for BBC World Service in London and with some of the most important news outlets in Brazil. And during the 2018 elections, she was leader of a project, fact-checking project focused on WhatsApp. Very interesting. She's also associate editor and researcher for DFRLab, which she investigates disinformation campaigns in Latin America. I know there was a lot of disinformation, or at least allegations of disinformation recently in Colombia when those protests erupted. So Luisa, plenty of online content is circulating about the origins of the COVID-19 virus, including that it was a bioweapon or the result of a lab accident, that US servicemen helped spread it, and that it leaped from animals to humans from a market in Wuhan, China. And not to be outdone, the Kremlin media put forward multiple competing disinformation that the US actually developed the virus and weaponized it to target China. Also not to be outdone, Iran in turn embraced a similar false narrative, which claims the virus was being intentionally, that it was being intentionally targeted by the virus. So you and a group of colleagues recently published a groundbreaking report called Weaponized, how rumors about COVID-19's origins led to a narrative arms race. It was part of the project by DFRLabs and the Associated Press. So can you explain some of the key findings of that report, and especially on how after the outbreak of COVID-19, how misleading and malicious information on its origins took root, especially among those countries I mentioned?
Yes, of course. Thank you for your question, and thank you for having me here. So ever since that we work with disinformation, misinformation, and overall the information environment, right? And very focused on democracy, but we had been seeing for a long time that health was a big deal. It was not like health disinformation was something that existed and we knew about that. But then with COVID, I just think things got like a completely different proportion. And we saw from the beginning, I think in January 2020, so very early on in the pandemic, we saw the first stories coming out of Russia, blaming the US for the pandemic. And that made us think about HIV and Operation Infection, which was something coming out of the Soviet Union at the time, trying again to blame the United States for HIV and saying that they invented HIV. So we realized that might be happening again with COVID, and we decided to investigate how countries would use information to try to push forward their goals and their geopolitical goals. So we decided to focus on 4 countries. We looked at Russia because of this, because the first narratives were coming from Russia. We look at the US, because of course, there were many narratives also coming from the US and blaming China for the pandemic. Then, of course, we had to look at China because that was the origins that we knew where the virus first appeared. And we also decided to look at Iran because at the moment that we started doing this research, Iran was like the first country that was being really hit hard by it. Many politicians were following you. So we decided to look at this. And we had some interesting findings in that research. Some that things were happening as expected, and some things were very different from what we expected. So when we talk about Russia, for instance, we know that Russia in the information environment, they have had some organized disinformation campaigns in the past. When we talk about the elections in the US in 2016 and IRA, we know that Russia acted to sow confusion in the US. And then we were expecting the same thing to happen during the COVID pandemic, especially when we were looking at narratives about the origins of the disease. But actually, when we looked at Russia, that was not really happening. We saw some things coming out of Russia from pro-Kremlin media and also state media, but it was not this very organized campaign that we had expected. Meanwhile, when we think about China, there was a very different trend coming out of China, because what does China usually do? So usually they're not like Russia. They're not trying to say, well, all other countries are horrible. They are trying to project this more positive image of China. And this was what they were doing at the very beginning. So they were saying, well, look at how we dealt with the pandemic. Look at how we were able to build this hospital in one day and how we are doing great. So in a sense, you're trying to like, you have this geopolitical competition by showing that your regime is better than others, right? And then that was the case until some narratives from the US started blaming China for the pandemic, and then they switched, they changed, and they decided and started using many of their diplomatic accounts on Twitter, accounts that had been created previously, but this was the first time that they were really used. And they started using all these accounts to defend themselves. So saying, okay, there's no proof that the virus actually, like the first cases were here, maybe it came from somewhere else. And they started blaming the US for the pandemic. So this was this different way that we saw China dealing with information and with this information competition that we think is going to be an important trend from now on. Now, when we think about the US, in the US, we saw some different trends. So in the beginning, there was this very strong influence from conspiracy theorists or QAnon, for instance, saying, again, blaming China and saying that everything was coming from China, etc. But then we also saw, we have to remember that Trump was the president then, and we also saw politicians, pro-Trump politicians, blaming China for the pandemic, and that steered a lot of xenophobia in the US. So those were trends that we noticed in the United States that we thought were important, especially because of this, like what is coming from, it's domestic disinformation. It was not necessarily coming from other countries targeting the US, but it was things that, narratives that were emerging in the United States and that ended up blurring all the information environment in the country. And then finally, one important finding about Iran, I think, was that it was maybe the only country that we saw in which all this idea that, because they had this idea that they were being attacked, right? That COVID was a security threat. And they actually dealt with it, like the policies were not really steered toward or like focusing on health. They were focusing on security. And that might have had an impact in the way that the country reacted and overcame the pandemic. So those were our findings when we talk about disinformation about the origins of the virus. Of course, later with vaccine development, we saw some of that changed, but disinformation and misinformation, they were a very important part of the conversation about the pandemic. And it set the tone for what was coming later, I think. So it was very important to look at this initial moment of how countries behaved and to see what was going to happen next.
Wow, fascinating stuff. Thank you for that. We will come back to you. With all this targeted weaponization of information, it makes one wonder where that leaves us as humanity. Also, you mentioned those diplomatic accounts. A previous panelist we had a few months ago called the way Chinese diplomats behave these days, especially online, as wolf warrior diplomacy. It's sometimes difficult to call them diplomats anymore, but anyway, we'll come back to you. This opens up, this is a great segue for us to across the Atlantic to United Kingdom, to Zoe Tabery of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Zoe runs coverage of their technology and digital rights, including privacy, surveillance, and AI. She has reported and conducted journalist trainings from Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Kenya, Indonesia, Myanmar, Nepal, and Uganda, among others. A native French speaker, she worked as an editor at The Economist Group and Amnesty International before joining TRF. Zoe, so I've read some of your articles. You've written a heck of a lot of fascinating stuff on how surveillance enabled by technology has increased during the pandemic, including, for example, among gig workers who in some places continue to be tracked even when they are at home, not working. And in my book, I wrote about how strongmen and authoritarian governments actually love the pandemic. Why? Because it enabled them to level the playing field in their favor. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about some of your findings during the pandemic about how authorities rolled out surveillance and are keeping it there, and even among private companies as well.
Sure, thanks, Michael, and thanks again for having me, and to Pranver and the team as well for putting this this great event together. Just to start, for those who may be less familiar with TRF, we're the charitable arm of Thomson Reuters, so where they cover more kind of business, financial, and political news. We write more about human rights issues, from women's rights to LGBT rights, and in my case, kind of tech and privacy. I think, Michael, as you've mentioned, surveillance has been a key part of our coverage, especially over the past couple of years. I think tech has been a kind of double-edged sword during the pandemic. So, while we've seen it unleash a wave of opportunities, from kind of life-saving vaccines, instant messaging, enabling online learning during the pandemic. Of course, kind of tech and surveillance have also allowed us to, through kind of contact tracing measures, to track the spread of the pandemic, be that through, facial recognition, drones, apps. One of the many of the concerns that we've reported on, and that I'm sure some of our panelists are involved in as well, are worries that these contact tracing measures and so-called emergency measures could be here to stay. So, many of them had been billed as emergency measures passed without any sunset clauses, so to speak. And the concern is that we could then see them fall into the hands of authoritarian governments to kind of curtail freedom of speech, track kind of online communities, be that gig workers, workers in factories, but even just, kind of office-based workers who now, working most largely kind of online, are having this kind of increased pressure to conform to, productivity standards. So I think from the surveillance side of things, it's definitely been a double-edged sword. And one thing that I would add is that you touched at the start, Michael, on kind of fake news and conspiracy theories. I think that's another area where tech, you mentioned the pandemic possibly having happened, but before the kind of era of social media and how we would have tackled it then. Of course, huge strides we've made in terms of tracking the disease and communicating more efficiently and kind of faster with people. But of course, kind of conspiracy theories and fake news have just completely exploded during the pandemic. Most famous of which, of course, is QAnon. And it's been fascinating to see that, having started very much on the fringes of society, they've kind of, from the Capitol riots to vaccine boycotting, become a mainstream threat with real consequences. And so I think understanding how these networks grow online, but also what we can do to mitigate the damage, is a crucial issue for journalists and tech experts to follow.
Fascinating stuff. And if I could throw out a spontaneous question there that came up when you were talking. We all know that journalists in the media sector were under threat well before the pandemic. Financially, a lot of media outlets were hardly surviving, but it so happens to say that journalism has become one of the most dangerous professions in the world. Have you seen anything during the pandemic where these restrictions that have been put in have really curtailed the media's ability to cover the pandemic, especially because, as you said, some of these, or I might have said it, some of this legislation is staying on the books. They don't seem to be going away soon.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm fortunate enough to be a journalist in the UK, so a largely, kind of media-free environment with very kind of if any restrictions on freedom of speech. But I think the past couple of years have been extremely dangerous, not just for kind of journalists, but activists, from digital rights activists to environmental activists, increased threats kind of against them. So we've seen, I think Access Now kind of put a report out a few months ago that showed that the number of kind of internet shutdowns around the world had kind of reached record levels. So be that in, you know, kind of African countries, Asian countries, where beyond just kind of curtailing comms and kind of freedom of speech, you see that having real term impacts in terms of people's livelihoods and, you know, ability to travel to their jobs or access kind of critical health services. And so I think that is kind of a double-edged sword that has fallen in many governments' hands. I mean, China provided a fascinating example kind of earlier this month in, you know, tightening. I mean, this isn't directly related to the pandemic, but you know, tightening its grip over tech firms and kind of introducing a sweep of reforms, you know, to activities that they consider harmful to young people. So, for example, curtailing their use of video games, all under the name of, you know, creating positive energy or, you know, educating youth on what they kind of consider to be correct values. But there is concern among activists that there is a lot more behind these measures, and that, you know, other governments could follow China's lead. So governments across Asia, for example, introducing a slew of data and data use and internet legislation, with, of course, the concern for activists being that these measures raise the risk of mass surveillance and of free speech violations. So I'm thinking of, you know, India passing rules to restrict social media firms. Cambodia, of course, is building a national internet gateway. And so this wave of, you know, security law adoptions, I think, is kind of here to continue. And the pandemic in the past couple of years, I think, has provided a new cover for that.
Thanks, that was great. And yeah, and if anyone wants to look at an example of broadly worded legislation, just go to Hong Kong and look at the national security law. You could drive a truck through that. It's so broadly worded. So let's stay in the United Kingdom. I'd like to turn to Eva Blom Dumontet. I hope I pronounced that correctly. She's a senior research officer at Privacy International, who investigates the impact of technologies on our lives, and particularly on the delivery of state services, including access to welfare support and healthcare. Her work has included investigations into contracts between the British government and Amazon, the use of AI in excluding people from welfare services, and the data sharing practices of menstruation apps. Prior to joining Privacy International, she worked as a journalist for the Franco-German TV channel, ARTE. So Eva, you've done fascinating research into AI in healthcare. And I know that early in the pandemic, we heard experts predict that tech and IA would possibly show its really good face by, you know, having the potential to not only predict the next pandemic, but also to help produce life-saving vaccines. It all sounds very fascinating, good for humanity, but I understand that there are pitfalls, potential pitfalls involved in the use of AI in this way.
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to go back to what you were discussing at the start, and the role of some of those companies during the pandemic, because I think this will sort of set the ground for some of the concerns around the use of AI in healthcare as well. I think, you know, we talked about how companies had transformed the experience of the pandemic for people, for users. But I think we also should remember the role they played, or at least attempted to play, when it comes to governments. Because I think there was very much a desire to kind of like join in the war effort, so to speak, at the start of the pandemic, where we would see Apple and Google trying to offer solutions to the problem we're seeing. We also saw some like less palatable companies like NSO, which was exposed recently by Amnesty International for their malware Pegasus, that says, well, we have the solution to the pandemic. Because at the time, let's move back to, you know, March 2020, when we didn't have vaccines. The solution to the pandemic was seen as like, how can we use technology to trace people's interaction and try and find out cases of COVID this way. That was very much the narrative. The narrative was very much that contact tracing was going to be the answer to the pandemic. One of the thing that was interesting for us at Privacy International, because we were very much involved in trying to trace what instances of surveillance was happening, what sort of like tech initiatives were taking place around the world. And I think what was interesting is that we were seeing patterns we had seen in other contexts being reproduced. So I've worked quite a lot on smart cities, for example, and smart cities very much emerge from, you know, local governments having very little resources, and then you see big companies like Google and IBM arriving and starting to interact with local government representatives and telling them, hey, we have this amazing, you know, tech platform that's going to solve all your problems, and you know, you can just like trust us with furnishing you, with providing you with this magical infrastructure that's going to solve all your problems. The spoiler that it doesn't work, and I think what's been happening in Canada with Google Lab was a good example of that. Smart cities often very much show their limits, and they show their limits when you don't have proper consultation with the public, but mostly when you don't have sort of like a fundamental vision of what the problem you're trying to address. What is the fundamental solutions to the problem? Because I think tech definitely has a role to play, but it is not the solution. And that was the problem with the narrative that was being pushed at the time, is that they were offering solution at a time when obviously we didn't have vaccine, but we have to remember, at least in Europe at the start of the pandemic, we didn't have masks, we didn't have hand sanitizer, we were running short on everything, and obviously like healthcare services were massively overstretched as a result of like years of cuts. So we were facing very much like structural problems, and tech solutions were promising us the answer. And obviously this is, you know, this is not how it worked out. Obviously I'm not saying that technology didn't play somewhat of a role in, but it was definitely not the answer to the pandemic. And I just also wanted to point back to some of the things that Zoe mentioned, is that the concern obviously is that a lot of this technology carried the threat of surveillance, of more control over populations, and obviously with no expiry dates inside. This is why we had started this project of mapping out what were the initiatives that were being started, because obviously we had to ask ourselves and wonder, well, when is this going to end? When will there be a back to normal? Because what we inevitably had in mind was 9/11, and 20 years after, we're still feeling the effect of the surveillance measures that were implemented on the back of 9/11. We were told that, you know, the emergency context, the threat of terrorism was justifying all sorts of new laws that today, 20 years later, as the world has radically changed, are still very much in place and are still very much shaping how we address, you know, questions like national security, and have also given a ground for all sorts of exemption on matters like access to information or data protection as well. And so obviously the concern was that some of those patterns would be reproduced. And the case that I would like to just sort of like quickly end on, that I thought was particularly interesting to follow, was what was happening in Israel. And the context there was a bit different, because it wasn't so much about tech companies, because what they attempted to do was to use the intelligence services, technologies that had been developed by the intelligence services, to essentially monitor the population, and when someone was tested positive, to give their number to the intelligence services so that they would be able to trace back every person they had been in contact with. And, you know, to put a long story short, there was an entire year of legal battle where this was like banned and then reallowed and then banned and then reallowed. And what was really interesting to see was that the intelligence services themselves did not want to be involved with this. And the reason they didn't want to be involved with this is that they knew the moment they would have to surveil Israeli citizens and, well, non-Arab Israeli citizens, they would have to be scrutiny. And they were very clear about this, is that as intelligence services, they're not expected to have scrutiny on how they work, on how those technology work. And they were even arguing that this would be a security threat if they were to, you know, reveal how some of their technology work. So they were not keen on this. But again, going back to what I was initially mentioning as this techno-solutionism, this belief that those technology were going to solve everything, there was very much faith in those technology among the political class, and this hope that it was all going to be sorted out. And one thing that I thought, you know, we'd mention in the context of the Frontline Club, which I think would be quite interesting, was how actually the union of journalists fought back on a lot of this, because their point was, if you trace us, we have to throw out of the window the whole concept of source protection. And so they had created this exemption for journalists where journalists were not being, the phone numbers of journalists were not being handed to the intelligence services so that they wouldn't be tracked. And anyway, eventually the project was ended. But what was interesting, what it was ended, was actually the research that came out of it. And the research that came out of it is that it was much more efficient to ask people who they had been in contact with over the past couple of days prior to testing positive to COVID, rather than using the infrastructure of the intelligence services. Because what would happen is that there was a lot of like false positive, a lot of people who ended up having to go into self-isolation without actually being positive. Whereas when people have to name the people they have actually been in touch with, they pretty much know who they've been sufficiently in touch with that, you know, they would be a genuine risk of them being positive of COVID. So yeah, tech, you know, not always the best solution that we think it is probably my conclusion of like watching it for now 2 years of pandemic.
Fascinating stuff. One of my favorite stories, in South Korea, they have very aggressive tracing technology. And one poor chap was being traced by the technology, and he was falsely accused of having an affair with his sister-in-law because it both pinpointed them at the same restaurant. And all of this was available publicly. So that all came out. Just quickly, do you think by the West using all of this technology and not suspending these emergency degrees, that it puts it in a dilemma, because we tend to criticize authoritarian governments and others for aggressively using surveillance technology and, you know, carrying on with emergency laws. Does that put us in a tricky place?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, it was really interesting being, you know, observing, for example, the app that Qatar had developed, because they developed an app that, you know, on paper looked exactly like what was going on in the West, but had two major problems. One was, you know, just the amount of data it was collecting on people, and the fact that it was extremely insecure, and very quickly they had to work their way through like security patches, because it essentially made the data of the entire population extremely vulnerable to and accessible to essentially anyone. But, you know, how can you blame Qatar for doing this? When, you know, the initial app that was launched in the UK and was very quickly withdrawn was probably hardly better. So yeah, that's obviously a concern, is that there's absolutely no more high ground to have. And, you know, the only, you know, ground we can have is to, you know, rely on the regulations we have, like data protection regulation that, well, we have in Europe that the US doesn't have, frankly. And obviously safeguards like, you know, time limitation and allowing people not to use those apps if they don't want to. That's the only ground that we could argue, because again, like it's not about saying you can't ever use technology, it's just about how you use it, how it is regulated, and how you can give people the choice, really.
Okay, thank you. Fascinating stuff. Let's now pop back to my time zone, California. Sam Biddle, technology reporter for The Intercept. Now I regard Sam among some of the others, of course, here on the panel who has intimate knowledge of Silicon Valley culture. So let's go right to it with him for a sense of if tech, Sam, has really gone from bad to good. Is it still stealing our data, selling it, coming up with more insidious ways to track us? Maybe we've over exaggerated their bad side and they're now showing signs of contrition and making things right. Over to you.
Well, short answer, no. But I guess the long answer is that, I think you can judge the question of how contrite, say, Amazon or a Facebook are, not by their public messaging, which of course, they bend over backwards to seem chastened and they've learned their lessons and they're going to do better. But in terms of their deeds, I mean, literally just today, Amazon has announced a drone covered in cameras that, with wheels that will follow you around your home, fulfilling sort of household Alexa surveillance duties. Facebook just released a set of sunglasses with cameras built into it. I mean, these are not the actions of companies that are seriously reconsidering their relationship with user data. I think that if Facebook and Amazon and their juggernaut peers were really as shaken and as you put it, contrite as they tried to appear, they might say, institute a moratorium on this stuff for a little while, rather than just sort of blasting forward full steam ahead. And I think Eva made a fantastic point, which is that there has been such a great deal of what she referred to as techno-solutionism, which I think is exactly the right term here, where this has been an enormous opportunity for these companies. Billions of people stuck at home with the only outlet available to other people through an internet connection is a huge business opportunity, and you see that reflected in the bottom lines of these companies every quarter. I mean, this has been, I think, one of the biggest data harvesting smorgasbords of all time. And it's easy, I think, for a Facebook or a Google to point and say, look, here's how we're keeping people connected during the pandemic, which, again, they certainly, there's an element of truth to that. I mean, being able to FaceTime my mother in Washington has been, a godsend. That stuff is important. But the other side of that coin is that every single Slack meeting or Zoom meeting, including this one, or Google-powered virtual classroom, creates a huge just plume of personal data that is then collected and repackaged and sold. And so, I think that no matter how much we might say, oh, thank God for Zoom, thank God for Google classrooms, etc., keeping that other side of the coin in mind and thinking about the trade-offs we're making here is, I think, vital. I also think it's worth keeping in mind how quickly we adjust to new senses of normal. I mean, I know that we're talking a lot about authoritarian societies and governments so far today. I remember that at the very beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of sort of alarmed media coverage of the fact that China was requiring QR codes in order to sort of regulate free movement within cities, and that was sort of oh my God, can you even imagine what it would be like to live under that kind of regime? I showed a QR code to get into a bar here in Los Angeles a couple of weeks ago because many bars are requiring proof of vaccination, which I think is a very wise policy. But I do think it requires us to have a little bit of self-reflection in terms of what we consider to be authoritarian, because what to me, and I think many others, seemed sort of beyond the pale 2 years ago is now just the way we get by. And so I think that's crucial to keep in mind, and projects like Privacy Internationals, which I think is invaluable, are invaluable for that reason. I think it's important to have that kind of global context in mind when we are comparing ourselves to other societies and how they're approaching this crisis. But to answer your actual question here, I think this pandemic has been a categorically terrific thing for the tech giants, and you know, it's very easy for them to say we're going to do better. I think we should question that that intention to do better based on their product announcements, which are not the conduct of a company that is in self-reflection mode.
Sure. Wow, great stuff. I love that saying, the pandemic, the biggest data mining smorgasbord of all time. To the audience, I'd like to remind you that we would love to take some questions for you. There are two ways, really. One is to raise your hand, and I'll go to you shortly after the next two panelists, or you can type in your question in the Q&A icon below there. Let's go to Marcus Geroy-Ware. He's a writer and researcher working on media journalism, politics, and big tech. He's a senior lecturer in digital journalism at UW Bristol and is author of After the Fact, The Truth About Fake News and Filling the Void, Emotion, Capitalism, and Social Media. So Marcus, we've talked also about the spread of fake news, and I also wanted to put it to you. Do you think the social media giants have taken more responsibility upon themselves to police the spread and stop the spread of fake news, especially when it comes to really important stuff like public health messaging, vaccines surrounding the pandemic? Because we often hear from Facebook. I was listening to a panel a few weeks ago, Facebook executives saying, "Oh yeah, we've removed millions and millions of fake news posts," but the fact of the matter is, millions and millions still remain there.
Yes, I think that's a really, really important question. Thank you for having me, I should say, and thank you to my fellow panelists also for saying such interesting things already, many of which I was sort of hoping to get to. So perhaps I can cross-cut some of the things that have been said. Are they doing enough to stop misinformation? I think absolutely not. But I think this really shouldn't be a surprise, because long before the pandemic, they were already really benefiting from having created, technologies that are there to exploit something that's really nothing to do with providing meaningful, reliable information to publics, whether at a time of crisis or at a time, we now imagine the years preceding the pandemic as having been some kind of cornucopia and compared to what we've been through now. Either context, social media companies for a long time have been, I think, rather remiss in the care that they take. And I think actually there's quite a lot of well-documented sort of cases of that. So, I mean, fake news in a purely business sense, obviously it's a very loaded term, but, various forms of misinformation and disinformation that go into making up that particular phrase are pretty good for business. And that sounds like a controversial thing to say. Let me explain. I hear a lot of the time people saying that, that data is the main commodity, that data is the thing that's collected, that data is the thing that's being sold. I think data is extremely important, but I take a different view as to what the kind of name of the game is with social media. And I think really for me, the commodity that we have to try to understand their businesses being built around is attention, not data. I think data is a really, really useful way of training the systems in order to be able to monetize our attention and convert that attention into, into actual revenues for their real clients. And I think that's a process that we need to understand. And, again, before the pandemic, that was already happening, whether it was, misinformation over here, or just people kind of spending hours of time that they don't really have at work over here, or, trying to kind of various different forms of compensatory internet use also occurring. There's been a long-standing kind of disregard for public health, public well-being, and so forth. And actually, I think quite a number of people who worked in that industry come out since. Unfortunately, they didn't do it in time for me to include it in my first book, but they've come out and said, we knew what we were doing. We knew we were exploiting vulnerabilities in human psychology and so forth. And so, that's not really a surprise. The fact that that they would kind of add these buttons and various things to try to make it look like they are dealing with the problem of misinformation in this public health crisis. To me, it kind of puts together some of the things that have already been talked about. We talked about techno-solutionism. We talked about, Sam mentioned this kind of performative way that they sort of say that they're contrite and then they do the opposite. Here we have a kind of performative techno-solutionism where their own researchers will likely tell them, you know, this won't work, this won't address the problem, or we've added this button and guess what, it's not addressing the problem. But you know, it counts in public terms as a solution, and so you know, there it is for now. And so it's very strange to be in this position where, you know, I think it's really important for us to kind of remember that just because we are forced to rely on technology companies because we're all suddenly required to stay at home, it doesn't mean that as far as the kind of long-term picture, we should be willing to tolerate the things that they do just because in the short term they were solving problems for us that temporarily we really needed solving. We kind of have to take the long view, and just as we should be kind of really worried about the kind of you know, maybe some of the laws that have been passed with no sunset clauses, as Zoe was saying, you know, and where that might leave us, you know, once the pandemic subsides, what we can do there. I think actually, again, long before the pandemic, we had already invited these companies into our lives, into our inboxes, into our homes, into our bedrooms, you know, and made them part of our lives in a very voluntary way. You know, being surveyed is fun sometimes, right? Unfortunately, right? So this is kind of something that we should be reflecting on in a much broader sense rather than simply kind of through, I mean, public health, I think, is a really useful lens, but I also think we can actually step back and look at this in a slightly more trans-historical way as well. And that will tell us, no, of course they're not doing enough because they're not interested in doing enough, because this is a cash cow and they will continue to milk it for as long as they can.
Great stuff. Thank you so much. Let's now go to Alex Kontrowitz. I hope I pronounced that correctly. By the way, Alex, while you were waiting to come on, two unidentified men behind you removed the parasol that was
I know,
providing you.
They took my umbrella. Yeah, I saw that happen.
So, Alex, thanks for joining us.
You can't have nice things in this life.
Right. You're founder of Big Technology, a newsletter and podcast about the big ones, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, and author of Always Day One, How the Tech Titans Plan to Stay on Top Forever. And this was done through 130 interviews with insiders from Mark Zuckerberg to hourly workers. Award-winning BuzzFeed news journalist Alex Kontrowitz reveals the culture, technology, and processes that tech giants have developed to sustain success in a business world where no advantage is safe. So, Alex, I was recently watching a panel in Kiev. It had Rana Faruhar of the FT and Kathy O'Neill. And they basically, if I interpreted what they were saying correctly, said big tech is just too big to fail. And that when they're called to Capitol Hill to testify, it's like the roles are reversed. They're the headmaster and the guys in front of them in the suits and in the wood panels are the students. And they aren't well prepared to hold their feet to the fire. Are we in that situation that they are seen as too big to fail, and that perhaps here in North America, we can't rely on regulation to, make them be more responsible?
Yeah, I don't think that they're too big to fail. I think in time, what's going to happen is that there's going to be competition that's going to take them out. We've never had a company that's just stayed on top forever. And so like my book is all about the plan. But I think once we learn the plan, we can figure out how to compete with them and, maybe disrupt that a little bit. So I do think that, it's not a hopeless situation. I also think that like looking to regulators to take them off their pedestals is misguided. Regulators can hold back some of their, biggest downsides and their greatest excesses, but they can't, all of a sudden make the market even, and it's not their job. So, they have been overmatched, especially here in the United States. Congress has looked extremely stupid when they've been sitting, beside some of these tech giant CEOs, but they're getting better. There's definitely a much more of a grasp of what's going on inside these companies among the members of Congress and their staffs than there was, when I started working on this beat, but there's still a gulf, and they're also limited by what they can do. It's really tough to write legislation that effectively, reins in some of the worst stuff these companies do without harming the little guys. And we see that oftentimes when we have regulation that it ends up crushing smaller competitors. So it's going to be a process. Chances are the market's going to take care of some of these companies before regulators do. I think Facebook in particular is in some deep trouble with TikTok, YouTube, and Snapchat nipping at its heels and taking its younger users, which is why you see them resorting to some ridiculous stuff like we saw in the Wall Street Journal today, where they're trying to get Messenger, taken by kids and used during play dates. Kids should be playing with each other during play dates, not Messenger. So it's real signs of Facebook vulnerability. And again, it's going to be time that's going to crush these companies more than anything else, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I think it was the week before last. It was revealed that Facebook is now using arguably its most valuable real estate, the news feed, to better promote itself because they feel they're getting a bad rep from big media. Alex,
but all companies,
sorry, go ahead.
all companies do that. They all push, promotional marketing in there. I mean, newspapers and television networks do that too. It's called a house ad. So that to me wasn't the most scandalous situation. If they change the algorithm to deprecate bad Facebook stories, that would be one thing, but just pushing promotional units, I felt that was fine.
And just quickly, we all want to know, what was it like sitting across from Mark Zuckerberg? What was the vibe there for you?
I mean, I think that like our is fine. It's not like never get talk around the big issues. That's why you need let it with Zuckerberg, and that it's better when the leaders of these companies speak to reporters. How venture capital firms like
sorry, Alex, you're really breaking up there.
Yeah. My connection's kind of
okay. That's
shot,
okay. I think we got.
Anyway, you can move on.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Let's Diana. I know you have to go back to your students and teach a class, but we do have an audience question from Claire Smith in the United Kingdom. Facebook delayed launching a version of Instagram for kids under 13 years old. Do we know why? And do you believe they will take Instagram addiction and damage to mental health seriously?
Well, I was really glad to see that. And I think there's a couple reasons why. There were a lot of groups that really lobbied them not to do this. Fair Play is a wonderful organization out of Washington, D.C. that has a lot of legislators and parents and teachers and all that really complained about this. They got a lot of bad press for doing it. Plus, there were the trio of articles that came out last month, I think New York Times or Washington Post, about Facebook's own internal investigations into Instagram. I just wrote a piece about it for Psychology Today about how Instagram makes teenage girls feel poorly about themselves and lowers their self-esteem because it's all based on kind of compare and despair culture, which, I mean, if teenagers are having a hard time with that, imagine a child below the age of 13 being on the same sort of network. They're just not prepared for the imagery and having that before you have your ethical thinking in place, your abstract thinking in place is really disastrous for young children. So I think, for once parents spoke up and Facebook listened. So kudos to everyone that made their voice heard, and hopefully they're not just waiting for us to fall asleep so they can come back in a year and try again. So it's a great testament to stay vigilant, and if you don't, that's what I'm telling parents all the time. We are giving these big tech companies our children's eyeballs. And some parents are giving their eyeballs away when they're like 8 years old. So think twice about that. It's an exchange here. And if your child is not ready for the content and all of that, then hold them back, wait till they're a little bit older, have them learn digital literacy skills first before you throw them to the wolves. So, it's on us to do that.
Right. And just quickly, UNICEF in a report a few years ago said when it comes to kind of helping kids navigate their use of these devices, more important for parents to spend time on what they're actually doing on the devices rather than how much time they're using up? Your opinion on that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's number one, because a lot of times we just imagine kids are wasting their time online. And especially right now, a lot of them are doing homework or they're talking to their friends about homework, or sometimes there's an interest that they can't have met in school. So they'll go to YouTube and look for a video on it. So much more important to look at what than, but when you're looking at the what, there's also, kids are getting a lot of news content via their devices. And a lot of the news, as we all know, is misinformation for one. So they should know how to analyze that. And there's a lot of very disturbing content that very young kids are seeing. So the what is important. It can be good, but there's a lot of what that can be bad, just like the title of your talk today, the good and bad.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Before I throw out a general question from the audience to all of you, Louise, I wanted to go back to you quickly down there in Santiago. Based on what you told us about the report you worked on, have you seen any evidence of state entities upping their game during the pandemic to become even more sophisticated about spreading their own narratives? For example, there are reports of China, which often plays the long game. They have this saying, you may have the watches, but we have the time. But anyway, there's reports of them investing heavily in Hollywood in order to influence the narrative coming out of Hollywood. So it isn't perhaps as negative on China, but have you seen anything?
Yeah, I think many states did up their game so that they could show a more positive image to the world. But we also do have some different things, right? We saw this from China at this moment. As I was talking to you at the beginning of the pandemic, China really used the war for diplomacy, etc., etc. But then when we look at vaccines, we did not see that much of China trying to say other vaccines were bad. And we saw Russia doing that. So Russia was just saying, well, Sputnik is the best vaccine. All the other ones are bad. And really, so I'm Brazilian. I was getting a lot of Twitter ads from Sputnik and many news saying that the Western vaccines were problematic. And I was not getting this from China. So I think we're still in a moment that states are kind of deciding and experimenting with how they're going to deal with it. When we think about big part of what states are doing is propaganda, right? And they have been doing it for a long time, but we do not have social media is something relatively new. So they are still experimenting with that. And I think it's still a moment that we have to watch and see how states are going to react. And this speaks a lot with what many people said here about the fact that we as citizens, we have to understand more of that so that we're able to create resilience and we're able to understand the trends and separate what is useful information and what is good coming from the internet and what is bad information that we shouldn't care about and we should dismiss.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have a question from Marco in London. I think this has to do with there can be over-aggressive legislation that can actually break companies. So Marco writes, early in 2000s, there was the case of Microsoft Explorer. What at the time was reckoned the biggest tech company of its time, Microsoft, was taken to court and its position of market monopoly, in this case, the internet browser, was questioned and broken. What's stopping legislators now from taking similar actions on other tech giants? Eva, I see you're nodding there. Would you like to take this up first?
Sorry, I'm muting myself. Yeah, no, I wanted to take this because this is something Privacy International is doing quite a lot of work on, because nothing's stopping them. They are actually doing it. This is competition law is, along with data protection, is one of the best and strongest legal mechanism to go after big tech company. And so we've seen, for example, the European Union handing 110 million euros fine to Facebook. And of course, you can argue that for this company, this is, just a drop in the ocean, but that was over the way they had handled the merger with WhatsApp, for example. But there's still a lot of work to be done. So we tried, and to be honest, failed to block the merger with Fitbit. between Google and Fitbit, but we are actually now in a procedure with the Australian Competition Authority to see if we can use their court in Australia to try and block the merger there. So there's actually a lot to explore. There's a lot for activists and people who are trying to challenge big tech companies to explore, because this is a legal mechanism that I think has been sort of overlooked and has potentially a lot of power in controlling big tech company. At least when it comes to the big fines that have emerged recently, it has come from competition authorities.
Anyone else on that one? Okay. Also, I had a question when it came to, we've been talking a lot about the role people should play. Do any of you have any feelings on how that should actually be done? People need to probably know, is it their decisions made at the ballot box? Is it supporting companies like Privacy International? What any of you have any thoughts on that, on how best to nudge these tech companies to do something, but also pressing the right buttons in order for that to happen? Go ahead, Marcus.
I would say, I've always tended to have a slightly more pessimistic view of regulation. So I'm pleased to hear from Eva that there are some sort of successes there, because obviously one of the problems, as I'm sure no one on the panel will need telling, is the transnational nature of these companies and the fact that they have to be followed in courts around the world in order to make them do things that amount to sort of basic decency. But I think that obviously it sounds from what Eva said, like that regulation can be part of that. I think though that really we shouldn't be looking to one solution, right? They're actually one of the best things we could all be doing, at least as far as Facebook in particular is concerned, is deactivating our accounts. And I know that sounds rather unrealistic, but it's unrealistic if one person does it, or if 10 or if 100 do it. But if that was kind of mainstreamed a bit more and made into a bit more of a, actually that's really where we start to hurt them much more. I think there are also kind of a number of other ways that we can put pressure on them. As we know, we were talking about earlier, optics, their PR is incredibly important to them. The sense of this performative kind of self-flagellation they do, and then these kind of rather carefully scripted things that they're putting out into the world. Again, we can and we should be calling them out. One of the things that I think really disappoints me is that a lot of the journalism that I see about social media networks is not really very kind of incisive about getting to the kind of the core of what this is about, what this business model really amounts to, what the kind of the ruthlessness and recklessness of it. I think, again, there's lots of other things we could have gotten to, or we will maybe in other panels in the future about kind of, it's just an old question of how journalists are meant to deal with crises and how we're meant to talk about these kinds of things. And is it just a question of like telling both sides of the story and all of that kind of that? I think when you're responding to crises, which I would argue this is, that's not really a model that holds, and we need to be a bit more kind of like going in for the jugular and saying, well, here is all this evidence of what they've been doing for so long. We need to kind of destroy those kind of good optics or that air of legitimacy, which I think for the most part they're still able to maintain. So there's at least 3 different ways that I think we can fight back against them there.
Zoe, did I see your hand up? Or?
Sure, thank you. No, I completely agree with both Eva and Marcus that regulation is no silver bullet, but also I think we need to remember that consumers and the public at large aren't kind of a homogenous entity. And very often when we talk about surveillance and privacy, the biggest risk is to those who have little to no say on how their data is being used. So I think when we talk about regulation, we need to think about measures to kind of protect the most vulnerable groups. I'm thinking of the poorest, of minority communities, so things like data protection or independent kind of consumer watchdog organizations. An idea that's increasingly being kind of thrown around is the idea of improving kind of data stewardship and data trusts, which some activists kind of say could help minorities and groups who are suffering as a result of how data about them is used. Because often one of the most pernicious and kind of tricky issues when it comes to data rights in in developing countries is the impact of data on people for whom very little data is available or who have very little control over it. So I think recognizing that different consumers have different either kind of literacy or access or kind of knowledge to their data is key, rather than having kind of one size fits all approach.
Thanks. And before I go to Sam, I just wanted to ask you as well, because that your article about the gig workers really stuck in my head and resonated with me. You know, we've heard reports in China of gig workers working ridiculously long hours, even though all of this technology is available. We saw that famous image coming out of the floods in New York City recently of the gig worker delivering a pizza or something through torrential rains. Do you see technology being able to play a role for the good side in terms of helping these, I would say, marginalized workers, you know, have better protection and just work more in a more reasonable way?
I would hope so. I mean, we have one example from our reporting, you know, albeit anecdotal, but where we hope that we were kind of able to move the needle. We a few months ago published an investigation on gig workers, food delivery drivers in South Africa, who were kind of, as they were trying to supplement their income during the pandemic, taking increased risks on the road. Of course, South Africa's kind of dismal road safety record. And you add to that the challenges in terms of poor safety equipment, a lack of insurance policies to protect the drivers, and also because of many of their, you know, migrant and undocumented status, the fact that they feared kind of reporting accidents or cases of abuses to the authorities. So we put out the piece, we reached out to the main kind of gig platforms, which, you know, in South Africa were and are kind of Uber and Mr. Food D, and, you know, we had kind of dozens and dozens of food delivery drivers kind of speaking to us, and we were really heartened to see that Uber South Africa kind of pledged not only to start safety campaigns for food delivery drivers, which didn't exist before, but also to review their insurance policies. So the very kind of tricky thing with those policies is that very often they set unreasonably high standards. So you have to have been in hospital for at least 48 hours to kind of qualify for any form of compensation. Very often the hospital, being overcrowded, will discharge you after a number of hours. So Uber lowered that threshold to 24 hours, which many said is still kind of too high, but now allows you know, many more workers to kind of claim for compensation. So I think that's one of the cases where just journalism and kind of telling those stories can hopefully help put pressure on big tech, but also follow it through and make sure that, you know, with Uber, they didn't just pledge they would do it. They have actually reviewed their insurance policy. I think you're on mute, Michael.
We're slowly beginning to wrap up, but we had a really good question. And Sam, maybe you want to take this, and anyone else who wants to jump in. There's much from Melinda in London, there's much that was said about tech, especially during the pandemic. My question is, what are the temporary trends and what are the permanent trends?
That's a fantastic question. You know, we don't know yet, which is my cop-out answer. I mean, I worry that we're going to be stuck with a lot of the bad trends, and a lot of what we thought of as the good trends will be sort of you know, dust in the wind. You know, I'm thinking about how we become accustomed to more persistent, more invasive forms of, you know, population scale monitoring. You know, things that again would have made us very uncomfortable 2 years ago. Now we think of, we've grown to think of quite quickly as commonplace and just part of the fabric of our everyday. I mean, I think that one trend you can certainly bank on is companies will continue to attempt to funnel literally as much human behavior onto their platforms as possible in order to quantify it. That is that no one will ever go broke betting on that continuing, and which I think actually sort of brings me back to the prior question about regulation. I mean, I think antitrust considerations are important, but you know, I also think it's important to maybe question whether you know, this trend of inexorable data harvesting is best combated via traditional, you know, market-based approaches. I mean, I think that Facebook really deserves a lot of comparison, not to, you know, say AT&T or Microsoft, but to Philip Morris. You know, I mean, the problem with the giant tobacco companies wasn't just that they were giant. It was that they were selling a product they knew was causing cancer and emphysema and killing people, and they kept doing it and didn't care and didn't face any consequences. So, I wonder whether, in addition to something like, antitrust inquiries, which we have here in the US barely, there's very little political will here to do anything like that, unfortunately. But whether it might make more sense to approach and combat some of these pernicious trends through, looking at in terms of consumer harm. Are you hurting people? Forget the scale, forget the competitive nature of it, or whether you're boxing out small upstarts. I mean, is your company harming people? And if it is, why is that legal? I think there's sort of more fundamental questions at hand here, rather than just questions of market fairness and competition, which, again, I mean, should be part of the equation, but may not be sufficient.
Okay, great. This is a good one. So I'll preface it with saying that here on Vancouver Island, the adoption spurt of telehealth has been through the roof. I know that in Russia, people don't want to go to hospitals because they could go to hospital to die. In China, the adoption of telehealth has been absolutely massive, and also accelerated by AI and other things. Anyone want to take this one, whether they think that COVID-19 will actually help healthcare technology secure a positive legacy? Because, again, it is assisting people to stay at home and be safe and do consultations with professionals online. Eva, how about you? Because perhaps there are privacy issues
no, absolutely. To be fair, for me, it kind of, to bring back again this question of what are the concerns that arise from the existing sort of analog world, so to speak, that we are going to bring back into telehealth. And so here, I think that there's two big concerns. It's obviously question of access. Are we going to build a sort of two speed, two pace healthcare systems where wealthier people will be able to access healthcare that's involve actual engaging with actual human being, whereas poor people will have to rely on a healthcare system that's essentially ruled by algorithms. And the other thing that I think is really important is the whole question of bias in AI that has been addressed on different aspects, is that we know that the moment we use, in order to build an AI system, we need to have data sets. And when we have biased data sets, and to be fair, all data sets are biased, all data sets always, reflect the bias of those who were collecting the data in the first place. You have an AI that effectively reproduces this mistake. The reason it concerns me particularly with the question of healthcare is that we know in the medical world that we have at least two big biases that we need to address, and that's starting emerging. And one is the question of women, and how we fail to address a lot of the questions around pathology, the questions of pain, how diseases that affect women specifically are massively under researched. The other question is different ethnic group. How, for example, we fail to address the specific concerns of Black people during COVID, because one of the big questions that the NHS helpline was asking you on the phone was are your lips blue? Because that was their sort of factor to decide if someone was running low on oxygen, which for people of color was completely useless as a question. And that kind of reflects the problem of not having healthcare system that sufficiently take into account the specific need of women, of people of color, obviously of trans people as well. So once we already have more and more AI that's going to be used as part of issues like cancer detection, disease detection, but also diagnosis, also, deciding who are the patients we want to prioritize. What are the risks that the biases that we already have are going to be reproduced by artificial intelligence, and what will be the avenues for redress in that world?
Thank you very, very much. We've pretty much reached our time limit, so I'm going to send all of my thanks to the panelists, to Diana, Zoe, Marcus, Louisa, Sam, Eva, and Alex, who we lost, I think, due to technology. Your time is very valuable, and we thank you. We actually wanted to push the needle on technology and make this panel hybrid. I see we have at least 3 people in California who probably could have pulled it off, but because of travel restrictions and other things, it's tough. But I know Pranvera very much wants to have more in-person or at least hybrid events. So let's aim for that for the next one. A point I wanted to mention before, very brief summing up, is that we could probably have done a panel by itself on the digital divide. I've got to say, when the panic first hit, I went to New York City on my way back here, and just riding the subway, you could see who couldn't work from home, who couldn't afford Ubers, who had to take the subway, who couldn't do the social distancing. Also, we have to remember a lot of folks don't have access to these sophisticated smartphones, or they can't afford data. Many don't have, Diana probably knows the number, but many households in the United States cannot afford high-speed broadband. So it's very difficult to not only work from home, but to just do distance learning. So a lot to think about there, and maybe next time we'll get 1 or 2 of the folks from the big tech companies. But I think we're leaving with a kind of consensus that perhaps it's too early, maybe even way too early, to conclude that tech has gone from bad to good during the pandemic, but there have been some good examples of how technology has been used in a positive and responsible way for humanity. I think we've also, Diana provided some helpful advice there to parents on how to manage screen time and devices in general, but also I think the onus is very much on us, the consumer, the user, to monitor not only our time spent, but also our data and how it's being used. Maybe from time to time, take some time to read those ridiculously long agreements that we all agree to when we press click. And then of course, we have to be cognizant of how long these so-called emergency powers stay. I know, for example, quickly here in the province of British Columbia, I get an email every month from the government saying, oh, by the way, we're extending the emergency powers another month, and there's hardly a peep from anybody. So definitely on how long this legislation stays, whether they become part of the new normal. And then finally, of course, onus is on us to choose our legislators carefully. I think personally, a lot of politicians are very good at being just that, politicians getting elected. But when it comes to managing a crisis, they're not that well prepared. And a lot more emphasis, I think, on building back better is required. So again, thank you very, very much, panelists. Thank you to the audience for taking part. And please do check the Frontline Events page often for upcoming panels. As I said, some are in person, some hybrid, some completely virtual. And finally, between all of us, there's a lot of books that have been published, reports, and fantastic articles. So do take the time to look at what our panelists have written and to support them as well. Thank you very, very much. Have a good morning, afternoon, or evening.